They left her to die because her legs no longer worked. 3 days under the Arizona sun in 1883, and Taza, the woman once called Swift, lay abandoned by her own Chiricahua clan. 20 years old, a tracker whose eyes could read stories in dust and stone, now paralyzed from the waist down after a cavalry ambush. The medicine man had spoken. She was a burden, an omen of misfortune for a people already starving and hunted. They gave her half a canteen and a steel knife. The choice was clear, honorable even. End it quickly, or wait for the vultures that already circled overhead, black stitches against the merciless blue. Taza did not weep. The Gila Mountains had taught her that weakness invited only a faster death. She gripped the canteen, her knuckles white against the worn leather, and stared at the sky with eyes that refused to dim. Her body was broken, yes, but her will, forged in the high desert winds and sharpened on 100 survival trails, remained unshaken. The spirits could wait. By the second day, thirst carved hollows in her throat. Visions danced in the heat shimmer. She saw herself as a child, running through canyon shadows, felt phantom sensations of wind against her face, legs pumping beneath her. The cruelty of memory. She who had once tracked deer across bare rock now lay pinned, a prisoner of her own flesh. The third dawn brought an empty canteen and a decision. Taza lifted the knife, its polished blade catching the sun's first light. She began the old Apache death song, a rasping melody of defiance. Then, through the sacred words, came the distant thunder of hooves. 6 white men appeared through the dust cloud, cowboys from a nearby cattle crossing. Taza watched them approach, her hand tightening on the blade. She knew the stories whispered around Apache fires. Death by her own hand was mercy compared to what white men did to captured women. The lead rider dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, non-threatening. Jobiah Kane was his name, though Taza would not learn this for hours yet. He was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape that had shaped her, tall, weathered, with eyes that had seen too much loss to fear death. The other 5 cowboys hung back, hands near their weapons, watching the Apache woman with a mixture of fear and disgust. One spat into the dust. Another muttered something about leaving her for the buzzards, that it was nature's way. Jobiah raised his hand for silence. He knelt 10 feet from where Taza lay, not closing the distance, not presuming. He set a canteen in the sand between them and pushed it forward with his boot. The gesture was simple, but in that moment, it contained a universe of meaning. Taza stared at the canteen, then at the man. Her grip on the knife did not loosen. She had seen kindness used as a weapon before, bait in a trap more cruel than honest violence. The standoff stretched. The sun climbed higher, pressing down like a physical weight. Sweat carved tracks through the dust on Jobiah's face, but he did not move, did not speak. He simply waited, giving her the one thing her own people had not, time to choose. Finally, Taza's cracked lips moved. She spoke in Apache, words he could not understand, but the meaning was clear in her tone. A question, a challenge. Why? Jobiah's response came not in words, but in action. He stood, walked back to his horse, and returned with hardtack and dried meat. He placed them beside the canteen, then retreated to his original position. One of the cowboys, a red-faced man with a cruel mouth, rode forward. His voice carried across the desert floor, sharp with contempt. They should move on, leave the savage to her fate. She was probably a scout for a war party anyway. Bringing her anywhere near white settlements was suicide. Jobiah turned to face his men. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. Any man who wanted to ride on was free to do so. He would pay them for the week's work, and they could find another outfit. But this woman was coming with him. The cowboys exchanged glances. 2 of them shifted in their saddles, clearly considering the offer. But something in Jobiah's stance, in the set of his jaw, convinced them this was not a debate. This was a line drawn in the sand, and crossing it meant more than just leaving employment. Taza watched this exchange with the keen attention of a predator assessing a threat. She did not need to understand English to read the dynamics. This man, Jobiah, had just risked his standing, perhaps his safety for her. A stranger, an enemy by the definitions of the world they inhabited. She reached for the canteen, her movements slow, never taking her eyes from him. The water touched her lips, slid down her ravaged throat like liquid salvation. She drank deeply, too deeply, and coughed. Jobiah did not move to help. He understood instinctively that she needed to maintain her dignity, her control. When she finished drinking, Taza met his gaze fully. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was acknowledgement, an agreement to a temporary truce in a war neither of them had started, but both were tired of fighting. Jobiah approached carefully, explaining his intentions through gesture and tone. He would need to lift her, to secure her to his horse for the journey. Taza's jaw tightened. The vulnerability of being carried, of being helpless in a man's arms, ignited every survival instinct she possessed. But the alternative was death, slow and agonizing. She had already sung her death song. This, whatever this was, represented something different. A possibility, however slim, of continued existence. The ride back to Jobiah's ranch took 2 hours. Taza remained rigid against his back, her body tense with mistrust and pain. The other cowboys maintained their distance, forming a loose perimeter around them. Their discomfort was palpable, a living thing that rode alongside them like an unwelcome seventh member of their party. They passed through terrain Taza recognized, land her people had hunted and traveled for generations. Each familiar rock formation, each twisted juniper was a ghost of her former life. She wondered if any of her clan had survived, if they thought of her at all, or if she had already been forgotten, erased from memory as thoroughly as if she had never existed. Jobiah's ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent. It was modest to the point of Spartan, a single-room cabin constructed of rough-hewn timber, a small corral, a lean-to that served as a barn. No luxuries, no pretensions. A place built for survival, not comfort. As they approached, Taza noticed details that spoke of the man's character. The wood was weathered but well-maintained. Tools hung in organized rows. The small garden plot, though struggling in the harsh soil, showed signs of patient care. He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. Taza flinched at the contact, but allowed it. Jobiah carried her inside the cabin and placed her carefully on the single bed, a frame strung with rope and covered with rough blankets. The interior was as spare as the exterior suggested. A table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves holding basic supplies, but it was clean, orderly, a place where a man had made peace with solitude. Jobiah stepped back, giving her space. He moved to the fireplace and began building a fire, his back to her, demonstrating trust or perhaps simple exhaustion. Taza's eyes catalogued everything. The rifle mounted above the door, the knife on the table, within her reach if she could drag herself across the floor. The single window, its view of the approaching twilight and the mountains beyond. Escape routes, weapons, vulnerabilities. The assessment was automatic, ingrained. As darkness settled and the fire cast flickering shadows across the cabin walls, Jobiah finally spoke. His voice was low, careful. He told her his name, pointed to himself, repeated it. Jobiah. Then he pointed to her, his expression a question. Taza hesitated. Names held power in Apache belief, and giving hers to this stranger felt like surrendering something essential. But he had given his first, an offering of vulnerability. She spoke, her voice rough from disuse and dehydration. Taza, it means swift. The irony of the name, given her current state, hung in the air between them like smoke. Jobiah nodded, repeated her name correctly on the first try, his pronunciation respectful. He prepared a simple meal, beans, cornbread, coffee. He filled a plate and brought it to her, along with fresh water. Taza ate ravenously, her body demanding fuel after 3 days of starvation. As she ate, she studied him more carefully. There were scars on his hands, old rope burns and knife wounds. His face, beneath the weathered skin and sun lines, was younger than she had initially thought. perhaps 30, 35. But his eyes were ancient, haunted by losses that had nothing to do with physical wounds. When the meal was finished, Jobiah settled into one of the chairs near the fire. He did not press her with questions, did not demand explanations or gratitude. He simply sat, staring into the flames, lost in thought she could only guess at. Taza watched him, this strange white man who had defied his own people to save her. She thought of the medicine man's words, that she was a burden and an omen. Perhaps she was, but perhaps this Jobiah carried burdens of his own, and in the arithmetic of survival, 2 damaged souls might somehow equal 1 chance at redemption. Outside, the desert night settled in with its chorus of distant coyotes and the whisper of wind through sage. Inside the small cabin, 2 people from warring worlds lay in an uneasy peace, both wondering if they had made a terrible mistake, and both too tired, too broken to care. The first week passed in careful silence. Jobiah went about his work, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, hauling water from the creek, while Taza remained in the cabin, regaining her strength. He left food and water within her reach each morning before heading out, and returned each evening to prepare a simple meal. They spoke little. Language was a barrier, but more than that. Both seemed to understand that words could shatter the fragile truce they had established. Taza used the solitude to explore the limits of her new reality. She dragged herself across the cabin floor, testing the strength in her arms, mapping every corner of her small world. The paralysis was complete below her waist, a fact she confronted with the same stoic acceptance she had given to every other hardship in her life. Her legs were dead weight, useless. But her upper body remained strong, her warrior's training still evident in the muscles of her shoulders and arms. She could pull herself up using the bed frame, could balance in a sitting position, could move with surprising speed across the floor when necessary. On the 8th day, Jobiah returned to find her outside the cabin. She had dragged herself to the doorway and sat propped against the frame, her face turned toward the mountains. He paused, unsure whether to be impressed or concerned. Taza looked at him, and for the first time, something like defiance flickered in her eyes. She would not be confined, would not become a thing hidden away in shadows, dependent and helpless. Jobiah nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without words. The next morning, he brought tools and began constructing something in the yard. Taza watched from her position in the doorway as he worked through the day, measuring, cutting, fitting pieces together. By evening, he had built a chair with wheels, crude but functional. He had seen such a thing once in Tucson, used by a man injured in a mining accident. The design was simple enough to replicate. He brought the chair to Taza and demonstrated its use. She stared at it, emotions warring across her face. Pride bristled at the need for such a thing, at this physical manifestation of her brokenness. But pragmatism won. She allowed him to help her into the chair, and for the first time in weeks she moved under her own power. Her arms worked the wheels, propelling herself forward, then turning, testing the chair's capabilities. The freedom of movement, however limited, brought tears to her eyes that she angrily wiped away. With mobility came purpose. Taza began to contribute to the household in whatever ways she could. She had spent her life learning survival skills, and paralysis had not erased that knowledge. She sorted and organized Jobiah's chaotic supplies, arranging them with an efficiency that spoke of someone who understood the value of preparation. She worked leather, with skill that amazed him, mending his worn saddle and harnesses with tiny, precise stitches. She prepared meals using techniques he had never seen, transforming his basic ingredients into dishes that actually had flavor and substance. But it was her knowledge of medicine that proved her true value. One afternoon, Jobiah returned from checking fence lines with his hand badly gashed, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage he had wrapped around it. Taza took one look at the wound and began issuing commands in APACHE, gesturing urgently toward the landscape beyond the ranch. Jobiah understood the tone, if not the words. She needed plants, specific ones. He helped her into the chair and they went together, Taza pointing and directing as he collected what she indicated. Yarrow, desert willow bark, the leaves of a particular sage. Back at the cabin, Taza worked with intense concentration, crushing the plants into a poultice, her movements practiced and sure. She cleaned the wound with a solution she had boiled, then applied the mixture. Jobaya watched, fascinated and slightly unnerved by her competence. Within days, the wound that should have festered in the desert heat was healing cleanly, the inflammation reduced to almost nothing. She had saved him from blood poisoning, possibly death, using nothing but knowledge passed down through generations of her people. Word of the Apache woman living at the Cane Ranch spread through the small community of Red Mesa like wildfire through dry grass. Most of the talk was hostile, fearful. The Apache wars were too recent, the wounds too raw. Families had been killed, ranches burned, lives destroyed. The fact that Taza was paralyzed, helpless, did not soften the hatred. If anything, it intensified the disgust. What kind of man would harbor a crippled savage? But there were a very few, who were curious rather than hostile. Martha Henderson, a widow who ran a small general store in Red Mesa, had buried her husband and 2 sons to fever, not Apache bullets. She understood something of loss and loneliness. When Jobaya came to town for supplies, she made a point of speaking to him, her voice low so the other customers would not hear. She asked about the woman, about her condition, about what she needed. Jobaya, surprised by the kindness, answered carefully. Martha nodded, then added extra items to his order: fabric for clothing, soap, small luxuries that Jobaya would never have thought to purchase. It was Martha who warned him about Cyrus McDowell. The land baron had been sniffing around Jobaya's property for years, she said. The creek that ran through his land was one of the few reliable water sources in the region, and McDowell wanted it desperately. He had made offers, increasingly generous, all of which Jobaya had refused. McDowell was not a man who accepted refusal gracefully. And now, with an Apache woman on the property, McDowell had the perfect excuse to stir up trouble, to turn the community against Jobaya, to make his life unbearable until he sold. Jobaya thanked Martha for the warning, but in truth he had already anticipated the problem. He had seen McDowell's men riding past his property line more frequently, always just watching, evaluating. The confrontation was coming. It was only a question of when. The crisis arrived on a scorching afternoon in late summer. Jobaya was working on the corral when 3 riders approached. He recognized them immediately. McDowell's men, led by a vicious enforcer named Enoch, a man with a reputation for solving his employer's problems through intimidation and violence. Jobaya straightened, wiping sweat from his face, and walked to meet them. He left his rifle leaning against the fence post, a calculated risk. Reaching for it would be seen as provocation. Enoch dismounted slowly, his 2 companions remaining on horseback. He was a large man, thick with muscle, his face bearing the scars of countless brawls. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the anticipation of violence. He spoke in a drawl, his words lazy but his intent clear. Mr. McDowell was concerned, he said. Concerned that Jobaya was harboring a hostile Apache on his property. Concerned for the safety of the community. Concerned enough to offer one last generous price for the ranch. Enough for Jobaya to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere far away from Red Mesa. Jobaya listened without expression, then stated simply that the ranch was not for sale, that Taza posed no threat to anyone, that she was under his protection. The words hung in the air, a challenge that Enoch could not ignore. The enforcer's smile widened. Protection. That was an interesting word, he said. Made a man wonder what exactly a crippled Apache squaw could offer that was worth risking everything for. The insult was deliberate, designed to provoke. Jobaya felt anger flare but kept his voice level. He suggested that Enoch and his men leave his property, now. Enoch laughed, took a step closer. He was done talking, done with warnings. McDowell wanted the land, and he would have it, one way or another. The first punch came fast, a hook aimed at Jobaya's jaw. He managed to duck partially, taking the blow on his shoulder instead, but the force of it staggered him. Enoch followed with a combination, pressing his advantage, using his size and weight to drive Jobiah backward. The two mounted men watched, grinning, making no move to interfere. This was entertainment. Jobiah fought back, landing solid hits, but Enoch was bigger, fresher, and fought with the confidence of a man who had never truly lost. They grappled, fell into the dust, rolled. Jobiah tasted blood, felt ribs crack under a vicious body shot. He was losing, and both men knew it. Enoch pinned him, raised his fist for a finishing blow. The shot rang out, impossibly loud in the desert air. Enoch froze, his fist suspended. Everyone turned toward the cabin. Taza sat in the doorway, Jobiah's rifle braced against her shoulder, the barrel pointed directly at Enoch's head. She had dragged herself across the cabin floor, pulled the rifle down from its mounting, loaded it, and positioned herself with a clear line of fire, all while paralyzed from the waist down. Her voice, when she spoke, was in English, heavily accented but clear. She had been listening, learning during all those silent evenings by the fire. She spoke one word: no. Then she worked the rifle's action, chambering another round, the mechanical sound a promise of violence. Enoch slowly raised his hands, carefully climbed off Jobiah. His face had gone pale beneath the weathered tan. The two mounted men reached for their weapons, then thought better of it when Taza shifted the rifle toward them. The message was clear. She might only get one shot, but that shot would kill someone, and none of them wanted to be the volunteer. Jobiah pulled himself upright, spitting blood. His voice came rough but steady. He repeated his earlier suggestion. Time to leave. Enoch backed toward his horse, his eyes never leaving Taza. He mounted, his movement stiff, his pride wounded worse than his body. He spoke once more, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. This was not over, he said. They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. McDowell did not forget, and he did not forgive. The three riders left at a gallop, kicking up a dust cloud that hung in the air long after they disappeared. Jobiah walked slowly to the cabin, every step an agony of bruised muscles and cracked ribs. Taza lowered the rifle, her arms trembling from the strain of holding it steady. She looked at him, and he at her, and in that moment they both understood. They were bound now, tied together by an act of violence that had marked them as enemies of the most powerful man in the territory. There would be consequences. There would be retribution. But they would face it together. This broken Apache warrior and this solitary white rancher, united against a world that wanted them both destroyed. The weeks following the confrontation brought an unexpected peace, fragile and temporary, but real nonetheless. Jobiah's ribs healed slowly, and during that time the dynamic between him and Taza shifted in subtle but profound ways. Necessity had forced them together. Violence had bound them. But now something else was growing in the quiet spaces between words. Understanding, perhaps even friendship. Taza began teaching Jobiah her language, pointing to objects and speaking the Apache words: fire, water, horse, sky. He repeated them clumsily at first, his tongue struggling with sounds it had never been trained to make. But he persisted, and she corrected him patiently, occasionally allowing the ghost of a smile to cross her usually stoic face when he managed a particularly difficult word correctly. In return, he taught her more English, expanding her vocabulary beyond the handful of threatening phrases she had learned from necessity. Communication opened doors. Taza began to share fragments of her history. She had been a scout and tracker for her clan, one of the best. Her father had been a respected warrior who taught her to read the land like others read books. Every broken twig, every displaced stone, every faint print in dust told a story to those with eyes trained to see. She described the freedom of running through the mountains, of moving like wind through canyons, of being so attuned to the earth beneath her feet that she could sense danger before it appeared. The loss of that connection, that ability to move freely through her ancestral lands, was a grief that rivaled the physical trauma. She was not just paralyzed, she explained haltingly. She was severed from the very thing that defined her. Swift, they had called her. Now she could barely move without aid. The name had become a mockery, a reminder of everything stolen. Jobiah listened, and then, slowly, he offered his own story. He had been married once, he said. His wife Elizabeth had been gentle and kind, full of laughter that had made their small cabin feel like a palace. They had been building a life together, planning for children, dreaming of the future. Then the fever came. It swept through Red Mesa, killing indiscriminately. Elizabeth fought it for 8 days, growing weaker, fading despite everything he tried. He held her hand as she died, whispering promises he could not keep about the life they would never have. After her death, Jobiah explained, he had considered leaving, abandoning the ranch and all its memories. But he stayed because leaving felt like betraying her memory, like admitting that their dreams had been worthless. He stayed and worked himself to exhaustion every day, using physical labor to numb the grief that threatened to consume him. The ranch became both his prison and his sanctuary, the place where he punished himself for surviving when she had not. Taza listened to this confession in silence, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When he finished, she spoke quietly. She understood, she said. The survivors carried their own kind of paralysis. His was just invisible. They were both broken, both trapped, both mourning the lives they would never live. In that brokenness, perhaps they recognized something in each other. Not pity, which both would have rejected, but kinship. The practical aspects of their cohabitation evolved as well. Jobiah improved the wheeled chair, making it sturdier, adding leather padding for comfort. Taza insisted on doing more around the ranch, refusing to be simply a recipient of charity. She could not work the land, but she could organize, prepare, plan. She taught Jobiah defensive strategies that her people had used for generations, ways to fortify the cabin, to create sight lines and choke points that would make the small ranch far more defensible than it appeared. They established routines that spoke of domesticity. Mornings, Jobiah would carry Taza outside so she could watch the sunrise over the mountains, a ritual she needed like others needed air. He would prepare coffee and they would sit in companionable silence, drinking the bitter brew and watching the desert come alive with light. Days were spent in separate labors, him working the land, her working inside the cabin. Evenings brought shared meals and the slow, halting conversations that bridged 2 cultures and 2 wounded souls. There were moments of unexpected joy. Once, while Jobiah worked on repairing a section of fence, Taza wheeled herself outside and began singing. It was an Apache song, wordless and haunting, rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. Jobiah stopped working and simply listened, transfixed. The song spoke of loss and endurance, of a people who had been pushed to the edge of extinction but refused to disappear. When it ended, silence hung heavy, sacred. Taza looked at him, her expression vulnerable in a way he had never seen. He did not speak, did not break the moment with clumsy words. He simply nodded, acknowledging the gift she had given him. Another time, a brutal thunderstorm swept across the desert, one of the violent summer monsoons that could transform dry washes into raging torrents in minutes. The rain pounded the cabin roof like artillery fire, and lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, flickering bursts. Taza, despite her stoic nature, tensed with each thunderclap, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Jobiah noticed and moved to sit beside her, not touching, just present. He told her about Elizabeth, about how she had loved storms, would stand in the doorway and watch them with the wonder of a child. His voice was soft, nostalgic, and gradually, Taza's tension eased. As the storm passed and the desert night resumed its usual quiet, Taza spoke. She told Jobiah about a belief her people held, that lightning was the weapon of the mountain spirits, beings of immense power who could destroy, but also protect. She said that perhaps the storm was not a threat, but a sign, the spirits acknowledging their alliance, blessing this strange partnership between 2 people who should have been enemies. Jobiah did not know if he believed in such things, but he found comfort in the idea nonetheless. Martha Henderson from the general store became an unexpected ally. She began making excuses to send word to Jobiah, small messages about supplies or news from town that required him to visit. During these visits, she always added items to his order: a bolt of fabric, needles and thread, once even a small mirror. When Jobaya protested that he had not requested these things, Martha would simply smile and say they were on credit. He could pay when he was able. They both knew she had no expectation of payment. She was offering solidarity in the only way she could without openly defying community sentiment. Through Martha, Jobaya learned that opinion in Red Mesa was divided. The majority still viewed Taza with suspicion and hostility, but a few, like Martha, were beginning to question the narrative. An invalid Apache woman living quietly on a remote ranch posed no real threat. The fear was revealed for what it was: prejudice dressed up as caution. But Martha also brought warnings. McDowell was not finished. He was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, as autumn began to cool the desert air, Jobaya sat by the fire cleaning his rifle. Taza watched him from her chair, her expression thoughtful. She spoke suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. She told him that she had made a decision. If McDowell came, if there was a real battle, she would not hide. She would fight. She knew he might argue, might say that she had done enough, but she needed him to understand. Fighting was not about being able to walk. It was about refusing to surrender. Her legs might be dead, but her spirit, her warrior's heart, was very much alive. Jobaya met her gaze and nodded slowly. He had never doubted her courage, he said. From the moment he found her in the desert with a knife in her hand and death in her eyes, he had known what she was: a survivor, a fighter. If battle came, they would face it as they faced everything else. Together. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Together. Not benefactor and dependent, not savior and saved, but partners, equals, two people who had found in each other something worth protecting. Outside, a coyote called to the rising moon, its voice lonely and defiant. Inside the cabin, two people who had every reason to give up on life sat by the fire, finding in each other's company a reason to keep going. The peace would not last. Both knew this with the certainty of experience. But for now, in this moment, they had carved out a small space of safety and understanding in a world that wanted to destroy them both. And that, in the harsh arithmetic of survival, was a kind of victory. The attack came on a moonless night in October, the darkness so complete that the stars seemed to burn with unnatural brightness. Jobaya woke to the sound that did not belong, the subtle creak of leather, the muffled stamp of a horse trying to stay quiet. His hand moved automatically to the rifle beside his bed. Across the single room, Taza was already awake, her body tense, her head cocked to catch sounds that most would miss. She held up her fingers in the dim starlight filtering through the window. 5, then 7, then she gestured in a circle. Surrounded. Jobaya felt his chest tighten. McDowell had not sent a few men to intimidate this time. He had sent an army. They had prepared for this possibility during the weeks of relative peace. Taza had insisted on it. Her warrior's instinct understanding that the confrontation with Enoch had been merely the opening skirmish. She had taught Jobaya tactics her people had perfected through generations of defending their lands against superior forces. Now, in the darkness, those lessons would be tested. Jobaya moved silently to the window, staying low, peering out. He could see nothing, but he trusted Taza's assessment. If she said 7 men surrounded the cabin, then 7 men were there. He whispered the question without turning. "What do we do?" Taza's response came immediately, her English now confident enough for tactical instructions. "We make them think we are many, not 2. We make them afraid." They had prepared the cabin specifically for defense. Taza had directed Jobaya to cut firing ports in strategic locations, small openings that provided lines of sight while offering minimal targets. They had stockpiled ammunition, water, food. The cabin itself was positioned with its back against a rocky outcropping, preventing attack from that direction. Anyone wanting to assault the building would have to approach across open ground, exposed. But McDowell's men were not fools. They would not simply charge. They would try to burn them out, Taza said. Fire was the oldest weapon, and against a wooden structure it was devastatingly effective. Jobaya nodded. He had considered this, and they had a response prepared. Around the cabin, concealed in the darkness, they had dug shallow trenches and positioned obstacles that would funnel attackers into killing zones. They had also soaked the exterior walls with water from the creek every evening, a precaution that might buy them precious minutes. The waiting was agonizing. Minutes stretched like hours. Then a voice called out from the darkness, loud and mocking. It was Enoch, his tone dripping with false concern. He called Jobaya by name, said that Mr. McDowell was offering one final chance. Leave now, take the Apache woman, and ride away. The ranch would be left standing, and no one would be hurt. Stay, and come morning, there would be nothing left but ashes and bones. Jobaya did not respond. Speaking would reveal his position. Give them information they did not need. Taza nodded approvingly. Silence was its own kind of answer, and it would frustrate them, make them impatient. Impatient men made mistakes. Enoch called out again, anger creeping into his voice. He was giving them 60 seconds to decide. Jobaya used those seconds to position himself at one firing port, while Taza maneuvered her chair to another. She had a rifle braced on a rest Jobaya had built specifically for this purpose, allowing her to aim despite her seated position. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled. She looked in that moment exactly like what she was, a warrior preparing for battle. When the 60 seconds expired and no response came, Enoch cursed loudly. The attack began with torches. 3 men rushed forward from different directions, burning brands in their hands, intending to throw them onto the roof or against the walls. Taza and Jobaya fired simultaneously. 2 of the torchbearers went down immediately, their weapons falling harmlessly to the ground. The 3rd man managed to hurl his torch, but his throw went wild, his aim spoiled by fear. The torch landed in the dirt 10 feet from the cabin and burned uselessly. The unexpected resistance threw the attackers into confusion. They had anticipated an easy victory, had believed the stories that Taza was helpless, that Jobaya would crumble under pressure. Instead, they faced coordinated, accurate fire from multiple positions, created the illusion that more than 2 people defended the cabin, exactly as Taza had intended. McDowell's men fell back, regrouping. Jobaya used the lull to reload, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. Taza remained motionless, her rifle trained on the darkness, waiting. She spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of experience. They would try a different approach now, she said. Probably use the horses as cover. Advance while firing to keep us pinned. When they do, shoot the horses. The men will panic when they lose their mounts. Jobaya hesitated. Killing horses went against his nature, but Taza's logic was undeniable. The animals were tools in this fight, and eliminating them would cripple the attackers' mobility and morale. He nodded reluctantly. Survival required hard choices. The second assault came as Taza predicted. 4 riders charged the cabin from different angles, firing pistols wildly, more for suppression than accuracy. Jobaya and Taza fired carefully, methodically. 2 horses went down, throwing their riders hard. A 3rd rider pulled back, suddenly unwilling to sacrifice his mount. The 4th made it closer, nearly reaching the cabin wall, before Jobaya's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The wounded man crawled toward cover, screaming for help. His cries were pitiful, desperate, but none of his companions moved to assist. They had learned the cost of exposure. The man's screams eventually faded to whimpers, then silence. Whether he had passed out or died, Jobaya could not tell. Either way, the sound of his suffering had a profound effect on the remaining attackers. The knowledge that their employer would not rescue them, that they were expendable, was a poison that spread quickly through their ranks. An hour passed. 2. The attackers made no further moves, but neither did they retreat. They were waiting for dawn, Taza said. In daylight, their numerical advantage would be overwhelming. She and Jobiah could not defend in all directions simultaneously once the attackers could see clearly to coordinate their assault. They needed to break the siege before sunrise. Taza explained her plan in quick, urgent whispers. It was risky, bordering on suicidal, but it was the only path she saw to survival. They would create a diversion, make the attackers think they were abandoning the cabin through the back, where the rocky outcropping provided a natural escape route. When the attackers moved to intercept, they would be exposed, vulnerable. That would be the moment to strike. Jobiah listened, his mind racing through the implications. The plan required him to leave Taza alone in the cabin while he positioned himself in the rocks. If something went wrong, if the attackers realized the deception, she would be defenseless. But Taza's expression brooked no argument. This was not a debate. This was their best chance, possibly their only chance. He gathered extra ammunition, a knife, his rifle. Before leaving, he paused beside her chair. He wanted to say something, to acknowledge the possibility that they might not both survive the night. But words felt inadequate. Instead, he placed his hand briefly on her shoulder. Taza covered his hand with hers, squeezed once, then released. "Go," she said simply. "I will give you the signal." Jobiah slipped out through the small back door they had created for exactly this purpose. The outcropping provided excellent cover, and he moved through it with the stealth Taza had taught him, placing each foot carefully, testing his weight before committing. He found a position that offered a view of the cabin's eastern approach, and settled in to wait. Inside the cabin, Taza began her part of the deception. She lit a lantern, deliberately making noise, creating shadows that moved across the windows. She called out in Apache, her voice carrying, then switched to broken English. She was telling Jobiah, loudly enough for the attackers to hear, that they should run. Escape through the back while they still could. She made sounds of movement, dragging furniture, creating the impression of hasty preparation. The attackers took the bait. Enoch's voice rang out, commanding his men to circle around, cut off the escape route. Jobiah watched as figures moved through the darkness, abandoning their covered positions to intercept the expected flight. They were exposed now, silhouetted against the starlit sky. Taza's signal came, 3 quick rifle shots through the front window, aimed high to avoid hitting Jobiah's position. The shots were the cue. Jobiah began firing from his concealed position among the rocks, each shot carefully aimed. The attackers, caught in the open and fired upon from an unexpected direction, panicked. Some returned fire wildly, shooting at shadows. Others turned to flee, realizing too late that they had been outmaneuvered. The battle descended into chaos. Enoch, to his credit, tried to rally his men, his voice hoarse with fury. But discipline had shattered. 2 more of McDowell's hired guns went down, wounded or killed. The survivors broke, spurring their remaining horses into a desperate retreat. Within minutes, the desert had swallowed them, leaving only the groans of the wounded and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the still air. Jobiah waited, counting slowly to 100, ensuring the retreat was genuine and not a feint. Then he moved carefully back to the cabin. Taza met him at the door, her face drawn with exhaustion but her eyes bright with fierce satisfaction. They had survived, against all odds, against superior numbers they had held. But victory was incomplete. As dawn began to paint the eastern horizon with pale light, they heard the thunder of more hooves. Jobiah's heart sank, believing the attackers had regrouped. But the riders that appeared were different. 4 men wearing badges, led by the sheriff from Red Mesa, a grizzled veteran named Tom Bridger. Bridger surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had witnessed violence in all its forms. He listened as Jobiah explained the attack, gestured to the wounded men scattered around the cabin as evidence. The sheriff's face remained neutral, but his eyes betrayed his thoughts. He had known McDowell was involved, had probably suspected for some time that the land baron's methods extended beyond legal boundaries. But knowing and proving were different things, and in a territory where power and wealth bought silence, sheriffs learned to tread carefully. Bridger addressed Jobiah directly. He would take statements, collect the wounded for medical attention, investigate the incident. But he also issued a warning. McDowell was well connected, had friends in the territorial capital. This fight was far from over. If anything, it had just escalated to a new level. Jobaya needed to understand that he and the Apache woman had made themselves targets. The law could offer only limited protection. As the sheriff and his men worked the scene, gathering evidence and loading the wounded onto horses, Taza and Jobaya retreated into the cabin. They were both exhausted, running on adrenaline that was rapidly depleting. But they were alive. They sat in the chairs by the cold fireplace, too tired even to rebuild the fire, and watched the sunrise through the window. Taza spoke first, her voice quiet but firm. She said that she understood if Jobaya wanted her to leave, to end this conflict by removing its cause. She would not blame him. He had already risked more than anyone had a right to ask. Jobaya turned to look at her, and his response came without hesitation. She was not leaving, he said. This was her home now, same as it was his. If McDowell wanted the land badly enough to kill for it, then he could come himself next time, face them directly. They would be ready. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of an unbreakable commitment. Taza nodded slowly, accepting the declaration for what it was, a promise that extended beyond mere survival, a covenant forged in fire and blood. Outside, the desert morning continued its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the violence of the night. But inside the small cabin, two people who had been discarded by their respective worlds had found something neither expected, a reason to keep fighting, embodied not in abstract principles but in the simple, powerful fact of each other's presence. The weeks following the failed siege brought an eerie quiet. McDowell made no further moves, and the silence was more unnerving than open hostility. Sheriff Bridger visited twice, each time with warnings that grew more urgent. The territorial governor had received complaints from McDowell, painting Jobaya as a threat to the community, harboring hostile Apaches, creating instability. Bridger made it clear that his hands were increasingly tied. If McDowell pushed the matter through official channels, the law itself might become the weapon used to destroy them. Jobaya prepared as if for war. He and Taza expanded their defensive positions, creating more covered firing positions, stockpiling supplies for a prolonged siege. But they both knew that if McDowell chose legal means, eviction, trumped-up charges, pressure from territorial authorities, all their preparations would be meaningless. You could not shoot a piece of paper, no matter how unjust. The answer to their dilemma came from an unexpected source. Martha Henderson appeared at the ranch one afternoon driving a wagon alone, her face set with determination. She brought news and a proposition. A group of smaller ranchers and settlers, people who had also felt McDowell's pressure over the years, were organizing. They had been too frightened to act individually, but Jobaya's resistance had inspired them. They were willing to stand together, to present a united front. McDowell's power was built on intimidation and isolation. If enough people refused to be isolated, his foundation would crack. But Martha also brought a warning. McDowell knew about the growing opposition, and he was planning something big, something decisive. She had heard it from a ranch hand who drank too much in her store. McDowell had hired professional guns from Tucson, not local cowboys but killers with reputations. They were coming within the week and their orders were final. End the problem permanently. Taza listened to this intelligence with the focused attention of a military commander receiving battlefield reports. She asked questions through Jobaya, her English now fluid enough to follow most of the conversation. How many men? What weapons? What time of day would they likely strike? Martha answered what she could, then left as quickly as she had come, not wanting to be seen at the ranch longer than necessary. That evening, Taza and Jobaya held a council of war. The cabin was too vulnerable, Taza argued. McDowell's new hired guns would be professionals, not the undisciplined cowboys from before. They would burn the cabin methodically, force Jobaya and Taza into the open, then finish them. They needed to change the battlefield, use the terrain to their advantage. Taza's plan was audacious. They would abandon the cabin before the attack, take up positions in the rocky outcropping behind the property. The ground there was treacherous, full of hidden crevices and natural fortifications. Taza knew how to turn it into a death trap. Jobiah would carry her up into the rocks, position her where she would have clear sight lines. Then he would prepare ambush points using techniques Taza described. Simple traps that would slow attackers, create confusion, funnel them into kill zones. But the plan required help. They could not hold against a dozen professional gunmen alone. Jobiah would need to ride to the neighboring ranchers Martha had mentioned, the ones supposedly willing to stand together. It meant leaving Taza alone for most of a day, a risk that made his stomach clench. But Taza's expression was resolute. She had survived 3 days in the desert waiting for death, she reminded him. She could survive 1 day in the rocks. Besides, she said with grim humor, any attacker climbing up to her position would find themselves at a severe disadvantage. Gravity was her ally now. Jobiah rode out before dawn, pushing his horse hard. He visited 5 ranches over the course of the day, delivering Martha's message, explaining the situation. The responses were mixed. 2 ranchers pledged their support immediately, men who had sons ready to fight. 1 refused outright, fear outweighing solidarity. 2 others hedged, promising to think about it in ways that made clear they would not act. When Jobiah returned to his ranch at dusk, he brought 4 men, the 2 ranchers who had agreed, and their sons. It was not an army, but it was something. 5 men, including himself and Taza. 6 defenders against McDowell's hired killers. The odds were still poor, but they had improved from impossible to merely desperate. They worked through the night, implementing Taza's defensive strategy. She directed from her position in the rocks, calling down instructions as the men modified the terrain, created false paths that led to dead ends, positioned ammunition caches at strategic points. By dawn, the ambush was set. They waited. The professional gunmen arrived mid-morning, exactly as Martha had predicted. 12 riders, well-armed, moving with the casual confidence of men who had never met real resistance. They surrounded the cabin, called out for surrender. When no answer came, they set fire to the building with methodical efficiency. Jobiah watched his home burn from his position in the rocks, felt something tear inside him. That cabin had been his life with Elizabeth, then his sanctuary with Taza. Watching it consumed by flames was like watching his past incinerate. But Taza's hand touched his arm, her grip firm. The cabin was wood and nails, she said quietly. What mattered sat beside him now, alive and ready to fight. When the cabin was fully engulfed, the hired guns approached cautiously, searching for bodies. They found none. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Then the first trap triggered, a simple deadfall that crushed a man's leg, his screams echoing across the desert. The gunmen scattered, seeking cover, realizing too late that they had walked into a prepared killing ground. The battle that followed was brutal and asymmetric. Taza and the defenders held the high ground, forcing the attackers to climb exposed slopes while taking fire from concealed positions. The professional gunmen were skilled, but their skill was designed for urban shootouts and intimidation, not mountain warfare against entrenched defenders who knew every rock and shadow. Taza proved why her people had held this land against overwhelming forces for generations. She directed the defense with tactical genius, calling out orders, identifying threats, coordinating fields of fire. Her rifle never seemed to miss, each shot deliberate and devastating. One of McDowell's men, attempting to flank the position, found himself face to face with Taza at point-blank range. The terror in his eyes as he realized the helpless cripple was about to kill him was the last thing he ever saw. The turning point came when Sheriff Bridger arrived with a posse of 12 men. McDowell had finally overplayed his hand, hiring professional killers and launching what amounted to a small military assault, had forced the sheriff to act, regardless of political pressure. The sight of badges and reinforcements broke the remaining attackers' will. They surrendered, throwing down weapons, hands raised. In the aftermath, as the prisoners were rounded up and the wounded treated, Bridger approached Jobiah. The sheriff's face was grim but held a note of respect. McDowell had been arrested, he said. The territorial governor, faced with undeniable evidence of attempted murder, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges, had no choice but to act. It would go to trial, and with the testimony of Martha, the captured gunman, and the physical evidence, conviction was likely. But Bridger also delivered a harder truth. The cabin was gone, burned to ash. Even with McDowell neutralized, the community's attitude toward Taza would not change overnight. Jobiah and Taza had won the battle, and possibly the war, but they had not won acceptance. They would be building their future, if they chose to stay, in a place that would always view them with suspicion. Jobiah looked at the smoldering ruins of his home, then back at the rocks where Taza sat, being carefully helped down by one of the Allied ranchers. He realized that Bridger was right. They had not won acceptance, but they had won something perhaps more valuable. They had won the right to exist, to make their own choices, to define their own lives, and sometimes, in a world that sought to crush anything different, that was victory enough. As the sun set on the battlefield, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Jobiah walked to where Taza waited. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He smiled, a genuine expression of peace despite everything. They would rebuild, he said. Not the same cabin, but something new, something that belonged to both of them equally. Taza nodded slowly, and for the first time since he had found her in the desert, she smiled back. Not a shadow of a smile, but real joy. They had survived. Against all odds, against hatred and violence in a world that wanted them dead, they had survived, and that was enough. For now, it was more than enough. 2 years passed like water through desert sand, quick and transforming. The new house stood where the old cabin had burned, but it was different. Larger, built with care and permanence. It had 2 rooms now, windows that caught the morning light, and a wide porch where Taza could sit in her chair and watch the mountains. Jobiah had built ramps instead of steps, making every part of the house accessible. It was not a concession to disability, but an act of partnership, an acknowledgement that this was their home, designed for both their needs. The ranch had prospered. Martha Henderson's support had opened doors Jobiah never expected. Other settlers, seeing his defiance of McDowell and his survival against impossible odds, began trading with him, buying his cattle, treating him with cautious respect, if not warmth. The alliance forged in the battle had held, creating a network of smaller ranchers who supported each other against larger threats. Taza had become something unexpected, a healer. Word spread through the surrounding ranches that the Apache woman had knowledge of medicine that surpassed anything the circuit doctor could provide. People began arriving at the ranch, initially hesitant, bringing children with fevers, men with infected wounds, women with difficult pregnancies. Taza treated them all, using the plant medicines and techniques passed down through generations. She never spoke more than necessary, and many who came never fully met her eyes, carrying their prejudices even as they sought her help. But her success rate was undeniable, and gradually, grudgingly, respect grew. Jobiah watched this transformation with quiet pride. The woman who had been left to die as a burden had become indispensable. She had found a way to contribute that transcended physical limitations, had carved out a place for herself through competence and determination. The irony was not lost on either of them. The very people who would have celebrated her death now lined up seeking her aid. On a cool autumn evening, similar to the one 2 years prior when they had fought off McDowell's assault, Jobiah and Taza sat on the porch watching the sunset. They had established a comfortable routine, these quiet evenings together. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in silence. Both had learned that companionship did not always require words. Taza spoke first, her voice reflective. She had been thinking about names, she said. When her people abandoned her, they had taken back her place in the clan, effectively erasing her existence. She had been swift, but that person had died in the desert. The woman who survived was someone different, forged in fire and trial. She wanted a new name, one that reflected her new life. Jobiah considered this, understanding the weight of what she was saying. Names mattered in ways beyond simple identification. They carried identity, history, intention. He asked what name she had chosen. Taza smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed her usually serious face. She would keep Taza, she said. The name meant swift, and it had seemed like mockery for so long. But she had come to understand it differently. Swift was not just about running. It was about moving forward, about refusing to be static. She might be paralyzed, but her life was anything but still. She was still Taza, still swift, just moving in different ways. Jobaya nodded, deeply moved by the insight. He told her that he had been considering something as well. The ranch needed a proper name, something that reflected what it had become. He was thinking of calling it Two Rivers, one for the creek that ran through the property, the other for the metaphorical river of two different peoples, two different histories that had converged here. Taza's eyes glistened with unshed tears. It was perfect, she said quietly. The conversation turned to the future. Martha Henderson had written with news. The territorial governor was implementing new policies, trying to establish peace with the remaining Apache bands. There were discussions of reservations, of treaties, of ways to end the endless cycle of violence. The policies were imperfect, driven more by pragmatism than justice, but they represented a shift. Taza listened to the news with mixed emotions. Her people were being confined, controlled, their way of life systematically destroyed. But at least they might survive, might have a chance to adapt and endure. She expressed a wish that someday she might be able to help negotiate, to serve as a bridge between her people and the settlers. Her unique position, living peacefully among whites, might give her credibility in both worlds. It was a distant dream, perhaps unrealistic, but it gave her purpose beyond simple survival. Jobaya encouraged the dream. He had learned something profound from Taza, that resilience was not about returning to what was before, but about creating something new from the wreckage. They were both different people than they had been 2 years ago. He was no longer the grief-stricken hermit punishing himself for surviving. She was no longer the warrior defined solely by her ability to run. They had each become something more complex, more complete. As darkness settled and stars began to appear, one more visitor arrived. A young Apache woman, barely 20, supported by an older man who might have been her father or uncle. They approached cautiously, the man speaking rapidly in Apache. Taza listened, her expression growing somber, then gestured for them to approach. The young woman had been injured, her leg crushed in a fall from a horse. The crude splint applied by her people was insufficient, and infection had set in. Without proper treatment, she would likely die. They had heard stories of an Apache woman living among the whites who could heal, who had knowledge of the old ways. They were desperate enough to seek help even from one who had been cast out. Taza did not hesitate. She examined the injury with gentle, competent hands, then began issuing instructions to Jobaya. She would need specific plants, clean water, her tools. The treatment would be painful and take days. The woman would need to stay. Jobaya moved immediately to comply, gathering supplies, preparing space in the house. As he worked, he realized the significance of the moment. Taza's own people, the clan that had abandoned her, were now seeking her help. The wheel had turned full circle. The burden had become the savior. The cast-off had become essential. Over the next 3 days, Taza worked tirelessly to save the young woman's life. She cleaned the wound, reset the bone, applied medicines that reduced the fever and fought the infection. Jobaya assisted, following her instructions precisely. The older man watched everything with an expression that cycled between suspicion, grudging respect, and something that might have been shame. On the 4th day, the crisis passed. The young woman's fever broke, and it became clear she would survive, would even walk again with time and proper healing. The older man approached Taza, his demeanor transformed. He spoke at length in Apache, his voice carrying the weight of formal speech. Taza listened without expression, then responded briefly. After the visitors left, bearing their recovering patient carefully on a makeshift stretcher, Jobaya asked what had been said. Taza was quiet for a long moment, working through emotions she rarely displayed. The man had apologized, she finally said. Not for abandoning her, Survival sometimes required cruel choices, and Apache culture understood this. But for declaring her worthless, for taking away her name and place in the clan, he had seen now what she had become, the strength she had found, the value she still possessed. He asked if she would consider returning to the people. Jobaya felt his chest tighten. The thought of losing Taza, of this house and life they had built becoming empty again, was almost unbearable. But he forced himself to ask the necessary question. What had she answered? Taza met his eyes, her gaze steady and sure. She had told him no, she said. She was Apache, would always be Apache, and would help her people whenever she could. But her home was here now, at Two Rivers Ranch, with a stubborn white man who had refused to let her die with dignity in the desert. This was where she belonged. The relief Jobaya felt was profound and humbling. He reached out, took her hand in his. They sat like that as the sun set behind the mountains, two people who had been broken by their respective worlds, who had found in each other's brokenness a strange and powerful wholeness. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying stories that would be told for generations. Stories of a warrior woman who refused to die, and a lonely man who refused to let her. Stories of a ranch that became a sanctuary, a meeting place of two rivers, two peoples, two souls who found in each other something neither thought possible: home. In the years that followed, the legend grew. Travelers passing through Red Mesa heard tales of the Apache healer, who could cure what others could not, and the rancher who had defied the most powerful man in the territory to protect her. Some stories were embellished, turned into myth, but the core truth remained, simple and unshakable. No one had loved the paralyzed Apache woman until one man did. And in that love, not romantic in the traditional sense, but profound nonetheless, they had both found salvation. They had built a life that defied every expectation, every prejudice, every limitation placed upon them. They had taken their brokenness and forged it into strength. And on quiet evenings, when the desert cooled and the stars burned bright, two people sat on a porch watching the mountains, knowing that they had achieved something rare and precious. They had found belonging in a world that told them they had no place. They had created a home where none should have existed. They had survived, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, completely. The mountains stood eternal, indifferent witnesses to human struggle. But if mountains could speak, they might have whispered approval. For Taza and Jobaya had learned what the mountains knew. That true strength is not the absence of breaking, but the courage to rebuild from the shattered pieces. That home is not a place you find, but a sanctuary you create. And that sometimes, the most powerful act of defiance is simply refusing to let the world tell you who you are meant to be. Two Rivers Ranch stood against the desert sky, a testament to survival, partnership, and the unbreakable human spirit. And within its walls, two people who had every reason to give up had instead chosen to live, fully, fiercely, and together. That was their legacy. That was their triumph. That was enough. If this story touched your heart, we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, from which corner of the world are you watching this journey unfold? What did Taza and Jobaya's story mean to you? And if you want to experience more stories of courage, survival, and the indomitable human spirit, subscribe to our channel. There are many more tales waiting to be told, stories of people who refused to be broken, who found strength in the most unexpected places. Join us and let's discover them together.